I am Don Jolly, editor-in-chief of Dagger magazine, broadcasting live from the Dagger studio. This lecture on industrial media analysis, entitled The Star Wars Prequels Are Excellent. We have attempted this lecture a number of times. This may be considered the final draft and the ultimate summation of Dagger magazine's official position on the Star Wars prequels, recognizing that one's official position on Star Wars is something that is significant enough that the Disney Corporation and Mr. Elon Musk have taken public stances regarding it. Elon Musk recently saying that his Mars colony will only permit viewing of the original 6 George Lucas Star Wars movies. So this represents Dagger's official and final position on the Star Wars prequels. The Star Wars prequels are bad movies. Nobody is debating that they are bad movies. Does it suck to watch the Star Wars prequels? Frequently, yes. Is every scene of dialogue in the Star Wars prequels the most bizarre, kludgy, embarrassing, like pop culture stew, and simultaneously the most turgid, Freudian nightmare mess of psychology that has ever ended up in one of these massive blockbuster films? Yes. Do the Star Wars prequels make you feel good to watch? No. Do they make you confused and uncomfortable? Yes. Do they make you question the very reason that you're sitting in a movie theater in the first place? Yes. They are bad movies. They are like Jack and Jill bad. Entire careers have been built over pointing out why these movies are bad. Dagger magazine's official position is that while the Star Wars prequels may be bad movies, they are excellent art. Truly excellent art that can teach us a lot about how to exist in industrial society, because they represent the discrete artistic vision, as insane as it was allowed to get, of Mr. George Lucas. And as such, they exist as movies only as a small part of Lucas's larger industrial empire. And when you understand that empire, you understand that the Star Wars prequels were massive successes. They just aren't necessarily meant to be good films. So, this lecture is going to proceed in 3 parts. We will now move on to the first part. Hello there.
Part 1.
Hello there.
General Kenobi.
Hello there.
General Kenobi.
Hello there.
General Kenobi.
Hello there.
General Kenobi, you are a bold one.
I see that so fucking often because I'm fucking reading the prequel memes people on Reddit. And that's their favorite thing. They fucking love Obi-Wan jumping down, saying hello there, and General Grievous turns around and says,
General Kenobi, you are a bold one.
Who could have predicted that that dialogue would stick in people's heads? And maybe it's just because I'm seeing it repeated 10,000 times a day on the internet. But you know, like, I had that in my mind. This brings us to what the Star Wars prequels actually are, and the reason so many people dislike them. The Star Wars prequels are a series of extremely, and I would say escalatingly, ridiculous images that exist so divorced from their narrative context that they have no tension and produce only a kind of lingering dread. Because it's the scenes of people like in an action-adventure movie kind of setting doing doing acts of daring do, but the political situation in which their heroics exist is muddled, and you recognize that everything they're doing is a little bit irrelevant, and it doesn't give you the thrills that an action-adventure movie does, because they're sort of divorced from any kind of narrative context. There's just scenes of people fighting each other with laser swords and fucking getting in space chases that don't really have discrete stakes and exist in a universe where they feel sort of corrupt. That's what the Star Wars prequels are, and that's what makes them such great memes. Because think about just how compellingly weird this image is. This guy jumps down from a scaffold after riding a dinosaur and addresses a large group of killer robots by saying innocuously, "Hello there," because that's what Alec Guinness said in some movie in 1977, so it's getting repurposed here. Then the robot turns around, and like, you know, let's be honest, these are adolescent sort of fantasies. This Flash Gordon fantasy is an adolescent male fantasy, and you don't have to get too deep into the symbolism of everybody having their signature sword, their favorite sword that represents them, and you pass it down to your son. Ooh, I love my sword. My special sword. You don't really have to unpack that much. So Obi-Wan Kenobi pulls out his special sword, and then the robot reveals that he has 4 swords. 4 stolen swords, because he takes people's swords when they die, and he's a fucking ridiculous looking robot, so he's got 4 of them. And you see people recreate this, like I see kids in high school, like probably the same weirdo kids that were just like repeating fucking internet memes before most people were on the internet when I was in high school. These kids are repeating fucking prequel quotes, and they'll have 2 guys stand behind each other and reveal that they have 4 arms as they say, "General Kenobi." Like, that is a compellingly weird image, okay? I see why that stuck in culture. And the Star Wars prequels are so fun to hate. In fact, the Star Wars prequels have created a whole culture of film critique that did not exist prior to them, because they contributed to the explosion of video essay critique that came after Mr. Plinkett and Red Letter Media, Mike Stoklasa, Jay Bauman, all those guys over there, reviewed The Phantom Menace in a 60-minute video. And those videos are so heavy on material from the prequels. They're basically a re-edit of the prequels into a humorous breakdown of digital filmmaking and the narrative conceits of modern blockbuster film. It's very interesting that these movies can be rearranged in this way. And so, like, you know, you look at a typical bad movie. Like, I'll tell you about a fucking bad movie, and I used this bit in a previous video. There's a movie that was made in the 1980s called Power, directed by Sidney Lumet. It stars Richard Gere and fucking Royal Tenenbaum, fucking Gene Hackman, and it's a completely forgettable story about media manipulation in politics, and the only highlight of it is Fritz Weaver, who was acquitted himself so well on the old Twilight Zone in Third from the Sun and The Obsolete Man. Fritz Weaver plays a governor in small town New Mexico, and this is boring you already, I can tell, because that's what a bad movie is. Bad movies do not inspire entire genres of criticism. This is a film that has had a profound impact on the world of film and how people talk about it. Whether that impact is because of its quality or its lack of quality. Its baffling lack of quality. And you want to talk about its baffling lack of quality, the Plinkett reviews just like beat on George Lucas. And they're right to, because George Lucas was he's the producer of the biggest independent films in history, and these are the Star Wars prequels, because he built a media empire on the back of Star Wars, and he used it to fund these 3 very expensive, very technically ambitious films. They are the auteur theory carried to the nth degree. I don't think any auteur will ever make something this expensive or this free from studio interference again. We are not going to see Captain America murder children. We are not going to see Black Panther talk about how he's intrigued by the concept of fascism. This is the weirdest blockbuster movies are ever going to get. So if you're disgusted by what's going on with the Disney stuff, the Star Wars prequels are great for a revisit. And so too is Mr. George Lucas, who will be the subject of our next part. The ability to speak does not make you intelligent. Part 2. The ability to speak does not make you intelligent. It is useful at this point to recap the career trajectory of Mr. George Lucas, and it is credit to Mr. Lucas that so much of that career trajectory is burned into the public imagination. He has obviously had a big impact on people, And part of the reason why is the biography, the story of George Lucas. And the weird thing is that he's a mythologizer. He's a mythologizer of himself. And as far as he wants the story of George Lucas to be, he wants to be remembered as like a fucking dream weaver, like Garth Marenghi. Like, that's his sell for what he achieved. And I get it, because, like, the Kingpin has to pretend to be a philanthropist. But my boy George is a fucking empire builder. Motherfucker is Darth Vader. And I think he's a little proud of it, because I have seen the Star Wars prequels. So let's talk about how this little weedy kid from Modesto, California, this kid who grew up like we did, milksop dude, fucking watching Flash Gordon serials, fucking aimless young man driving his fucking hot rods. Like, I mean, that's maybe cooler than most fucking nerds who now are devotees of George Lucas, but it's part of the mythology, right? He's a little bit of a fucking troublemaker, but he's a nerd. This guy made good. And what happened to him after he made good is what he had to go through to make the Star Wars prequels. So George Lucas, young guy, coming out of UCLA Film School in the 60s. John Carpenter, Francis Ford Coppola, the American New Wave, they're all fucking around him. And he's making art films, tone poems made of disconnected images. Extreme, like one of the projects that he did at UCLA is this extreme barrage of images from Life magazine, this like ultra political propaganda. He's a very daring and interesting filmmaker. And THX 1138 student film and the studio version, the independent version, whatever they did, but the his version of THX 1138 for the big screen, excellent fucking films. American Graffiti, excellent fucking film. And like Star Wars and Indiana Jones, it had a major cultural impact. Without American Graffiti, we wouldn't have Happy Days. They made a bronze statue of the Fonz. If that's not significant, what is? Someday they're going to have to tear down the bronze statue of the Fonz, too, because I think Happy Days might represent a threatening image in today's political climate. And then he makes Star Wars. And people say he doesn't get enough credit, or that he gets too much credit for making Star Wars, which is perhaps true. Obviously, he had a lot of collaborators that made those movies what they are, that made them huge successes. Like any huge success, people fight over the scraps of it. Everybody wants territory. And George Lucas ended up with all the money, so he got to narrate that it was basically his creation the whole way through. I don't think it's right to completely eliminate his guiding hand, though, because at the end of the day, for most of the production of these films, he was the guy signing the checks, because he made the badass fucking business move of securing merchandising rights on a toy line that revolutionized the fucking action figure industry and sold Catholic idols of adventure heroes to young boys with mechanical precision for years and years and years, to the point where it's had such a lingering cultural impact that hobbyists on the level of model train collectors, like Michael French at Retroblasting, dive into the history and the meaning and the aesthetic value of these toys. Like, they had a big psychological impact on people and a big impact on the market. They created an entire American action figure industry that bloomed for 20 years. George Lucas, with Star Wars, didn't just make the film that started blockbuster cinema and directed us toward the inevitable path where we are now of just endless fucking superhero movies. He comic bookified the cinema, and he got a big portion of those proceeds. So like I said, he's a UCLA guy. He's all about independent filmmaking. He was deeply involved with American Zoetrope, writing early drafts of Apocalypse Now even. Like, George Lucas believed in the idea of independent film production, and he saw Star Wars as a chance to make good. And so he starts building this massive ranch, this complex, which he thinks is going to be what American Zoetrope always wanted to be. A movie studio under independent artistic control. A movie studio where people could make films that the studios would not touch, with the level of production value that the studios could not rival. He only had a distribution deal with 20th Century Fox, which was very lucrative for them. But George Lucas owned the property. He owned the merchandising, he owned the attendant characters, and he recognized that he could use that merchandising to build an independent Hollywood. This is a dream that I think we should all take seriously. Empire Strikes Back, he clashed with Irvin Kershner and Gary Kurtz because they essentially were trying to make an art film. They were trying to one-up him artistically. He wanted it quicker. He wanted it cheaper. He didn't want it as good because he saw it mainly as just a vehicle for producing merchandise, which is what you see with Return of the Jedi. Now, something else interesting happened around the production of Return of the Jedi, which is George Lucas's wife, Marcia, who many credit with saving the first film, Star Wars, in editing, left him for the stained glass guy at Skywalker Ranch. And if you want to read a heartbreaking account of that, I recommend reading The Secret History of Star Wars by Michael Kaminsky. This is when he made Temple of Doom, where it's like everybody's getting murdered. Like, going through this divorce kind of crushed my boy Georgie L a little bit. And that's why Return of the Jedi, he got rid of Irvin Kershner, he got rid of fucking Gary Kurtz, and he made the blandest of the Star Wars movies. That's like, it's got big special effects achievements, but the story is just kind of written off. Except for the scene with the Emperor, which he actually gives a shit about. But like, it's definitely a more slapdash effort than The Empire Strikes Back. Then George Lucas, for the most part, doesn't make a movie again until 1999. He takes almost 20 years off. And then he comes back and he not only makes one movie, he makes a series of 3 movies. What does he do in the interim? He builds a merchandising and a fiction and a video game empire on the back of the Star Wars IP. He builds LucasArts into an important early video game developer, and it continues to make big money all the way through the prequel trilogy. The only people that have fucked it up are Disney. Although I assume that those Battlefront games do make big money, but they're widely seen as scams. They're like the Nigerian prince scam of Star Wars games. That's not a badge of honor. George Lucas built a multimedia empire from 1983 to 1999, and he did it for the purpose of being able to fulfill his dream. A wounded version of his dream, because he's pretty much isolated himself from everybody in the wake of the divorce professionally. With the exception of Steven Spielberg, but Steven Spielberg couldn't come direct any of the Star Wars prequels for Lucas because they were non-union. Like, he's a little bit out on a branch right now. And he built a very successful multimedia empire. If you were a kid in the 90s, you remember they re-released the Star Wars movies. Big new merchandising push, massive Star Wars toy lines. And it was sold to you aggressively. Like, they did pieces about it on 60 Minutes. It had your parents' stamp of approval. It was universally praised by culture as significant and fun and like a visionary experience. And you always see these stories about George Lucas's imagination. Like, this is something that really got deep into people, to the point where it created something lucrative enough that they would report about it on the news. So we get to the Star Wars prequels. It's 1999. George Lucas has successfully built a fucking business empire to fund these films. What does he use these films to do? He pioneers digital filmmaking. He figures out the technique to interpolate actors from different cuts in the same take, creating bizarre Frankenstein editing achievements that had never existed in film before. He created an entire CG character before fucking Gollum that is a racist cartoon dinosaur man. He made the first full CG character a racist cartoon dinosaur man. He makes baffling, infuriating decision after decision on a story level while making technical gambit after technical gambit behind the scenes, creating new ways to produce, new ways to edit, and new techniques to animate film. He creates the synthesis between live action and animation with his fucking massive special effects department over the course of these 3 movies. And when he gets around to episode 2 and episode 3, he shoots them on digital cameras, and he starts encouraging cinemas to switch over to digital projectors. I said in a previous video that George Lucas replaced me with a droid, and it's kind of true, because I was working as a film projectionist. I could fucking thread 35mm film through a Cinemecanica projector. I wasn't the best at it, but I was learning a trade. Then Mr. Lucas comes by in 2005 with Revenge of the Sith, and suddenly 40% of my screen's got to be digital, and then it's just a creeping infection. Because with the digital projectors, you don't even need a projectionist. You just need a service tech that can deal with an entire regional area. You don't even need to do anything other than program the movies on a schedule and let them run, baby. Like, I got automated out of a job because George Lucas put that as a provision in his distribution deal with 20th Century Fox, and they strong-armed the theaters into taking it. And without that, I don't think digital projection would have grown as quick as it did in the United States. I think he launched that industry on the back of that fucking movie where Obi-Wan Kenobi jumps down from the scaffold, says hello there, and then a robot reveals that he has 4 glowing penises and attacks him. George Lucas is saying something in these movies about the process by which these movies were made and the reason that these movies were made, even as he creates the nascent industry of modern digital blockbuster filmmaking, industry which has completely dominated the world of cinema and produced the most widely distributed popular myths of the 20th and 21st century. What else am I saying? But in the story of the prequels themselves, I think he's questioning this operation. I think he's building skepticism about this industry into its progenitor films. I think the Star Wars prequels are deeply, deeply weird, and they carry the message of their own destruction, which is what makes them perfect memes. This will be the subject of our next part. This is where the fun begins.
Part 3.
This is where the fun begins. All right, so set up where George Lucas is at on a business level, and we've set up that these films exist not just to be movies, but to be industrial power moves. I should also mention that George Lucas invested heavily in the Christie DLP digital projectors that ended up dominating the market. Like, this is when people say that Vietnam was about selling Bell helicopters. This is the kind of maneuver that we're talking about. This is a power maneuver within capitalism, and it's the kind of thing that wins people lasting fame. And it's the reason George Lucas is hiding behind the fucking guys. Just be like, oh, look, Joseph Campbell, I'm a myth maker. I'm on PBS. I'm a myth maker. Because you know what he is? He's a fucking money maker. He's a little pope, and he's trying to hide it. But I think he's flaunting it a little bit with these Star Wars prequels, because the fun of the Star Wars prequels is that they deconstruct themselves in front of you in real time. They take the conflicting tropes and sensations and pleasures of cinema and make them into something that makes you feel uneasy and bored and often disgusted. The Star Wars prequels are picking up from the most popular series of films of all time, and some of the most wholesome, just films that even George Lucas said in the 70s, it's like, it's supposed to make you feel good when you leave. It's like a propaganda film for a very particular kind of joy in life and joy in maturation, because it's the tale of a young man who grasps his own manhood and stands foursquare against the forces that would oppose him. Very stirring, elemental stuff. Sold a lot of action figures. The Star Wars prequels come along, and they are the story of an order of secretive, bureaucratic, deluded, and short-sighted space monks that engage in pointless sword fights while the world falls down around their ears, and they remain completely impervious to the truth that surrounds them, that the world is coming to an end. The very first thing that you hear in the Star Wars prequels is Obi-Wan says, "I sense something, Master. It's not here. It's elusive." And then Qui-Gon says, "Keep your mind on the here and now, Obi-Wan. But Master, you told me to be mindful of the future." "Not at the expense of the living force, my young Padawan." So this is the first thing we see about our protagonists in these films, is they don't know what the fuck is going on. And their way of thinking is limiting them from knowing what the fuck is going on. Qui-Gon Jinn, the guy with the midichlorians that everybody hates so much, he fucking finds this kid in the desert. Like, let's go over this, okay? He fucking goes to a poor planet, and he finds a little slave boy who lives a meek and meager existence working for a bug. He belongs to a bug, and he fucking races cars for a bug. He does dangerous work for a bug. And everything that happens in the Star Wars prequels feels very like nicey nice Disney movie, like nobody's really gonna get hurt. Because the ideas in the Star Wars prequels are so fucking dark on a conceptual level. Like, child slave labor. He's a child slave who engages in dangerous recreation for a bug man who doesn't care if he lives or dies. And they find this kid, and Qui-Gon becomes convinced that he's Space Jesus. He's like, oh my god, it's so important that we train this kid. And that's not really what fucking gets him off of Tatooine. What gets him off of Tatooine is that this little slave boy, this kid with nothing, literally no money, is seduced by an older woman who is royalty. And she brings him to a world of beautiful images, giant Art Deco skyscrapers, massive clouds and cityscapes, no sandstorms, no fucking grubby, impoverished existence. And young Anakin is seduced by these beautiful images. And in Attack of the Clones, they're sitting by the beautiful waterfall, and they're going to Venice in their space boat, and the sun's always setting, and Natalie Portman's always half dressed, and the boy follows his compulsions. And that's creepy enough on its own, but not only does he follow his compulsions in that direction, he follows his compulsions all the way to murdering the Arabs that raped his mother to death. That happens in a film called Attack of the Clones. And the main thing that people talk about when they talk about Attack of the Clones is fucking Yoda breakdance fighting. George Lucas dropped a lot of fucking potent, nasty shit into these movies. And it takes all the fun out of watching your hero, Anakin Skywalker, save the day. Because he's fucking around in the droid factory and you're just like, this guy murders women and children. He does it in Attack of the Clones, he does it again in Revenge of the Sith, and they literally have a shot of him igniting his lightsaber next to a kid's face, and the kid gets scared. Like, there's some dark shit in these movies. Such dark shit that I think you have to take it as a critique of everything that he's doing, like very aware of the industrial operation of Star Wars, because ultimately he's trying to figure out how to produce beautiful, seductive images cheaply and expansively with no limitations, and in a way that is going to be profitable for him technologically, because he's invested in the technology that will produce and sustain the new industry that he is proffering by these bizarre comic book movies. And they're films about betrayal and about how these action sequences, these endless action sequences, are pointless distractions, while in the background, power is consolidated in the hands of a very few who have ridiculous and inhumane impulses, people that are literally governed by dark sorcery. The films he made in his youth, the Star Wars movies, are about a young man growing up. And the prequels are about a young man growing up as well. But if Return of the Jedi feels a bit like a brush off, Revenge of the Sith does not. I think this is George Lucas, like, really giving his opinion on what it is to be a filmmaker. And I think that what he's saying is you're producing seductive images that lead people to ruin and distraction. But he's also saying that the true powers of the world are nefarious, and they are consolidating power for themselves. But they will ultimately be defeated, because ultimately Qui-Gon is kind of right. Anakin is the chosen one, and he had to destroy the Republic in order to destroy the evil sorcerer that has been running human events. The Republic had to fall and the Empire had to rise for the next spiritual cycle to begin. And obviously George Lucas didn't have this all planned out in the 1970s, but I think it's significant that when 2005 came around and Revenge of the Sith came out, he started talking about these movies as the tragedy of Anakin Skywalker. I think he sees the tragedy of Anakin Skywalker as the tragedy of George Lucas, the man who became too much of a machine. And he became too much of a machine because he thought that he was going to save this idealistic dream, which is his love for Padme, for these beautiful images, these beautiful film images. Padme is not a character. Padme is a series of beautiful images, consciously beautiful images. And she's associated with wealth and prestige and emotional openness. And George Lucas and Anakin Skywalker failed to live up to those beautiful images. They were seduced by those beautiful images, and those images destroyed them and led them down a path to covetous, industrial uncreation. So you feel a little something when you see fucking Hayden Christensen get his arms and legs cut off by Ewan McGregor. I don't think George Lucas... You know, this is not uncommon for 20th century media figures. Like Bob Dylan did this. He made a song called Things Have Changed with the chorus, I used to care, but things have changed. And since then, it's been open season. Movie soundtracks, like big Hollywood movie soundtracks, not just Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid. Commercials. The Star Wars prequels, George Lucas knew exactly how successful they would be as works of cinema, and they made a lot of money, and they created, as much as Star Wars created, the infrastructure, economic and technical, for the modern blockbuster film, which has, of course, come to dominate Hollywood in years since. He also consciously made a bizarre, disturbing cry for help, where he talks about how acting in the world of big budget film and actively innovating it in a technological way as he did has made him more machine than man and taken away some portion of his humanity. And the thing that cost him all of that is his inability to let go of the people in his life that he loves and to offer them autonomous operation. He was too attached. George Lucas is saying, I'm sorry, Marcia. I'm sorry that you left me for the stained glass guy at Skywalker Ranch right before I made Return of the Jedi. And that I put a scene in the movie where a giant alien slug man licks a girl in a bikini and threatens to rape her. Sorry I did that. My bad. I should have been more open. I should have been more loving. But you know what? I'm there for the kids. And if they like pee-pee doo-doo bullshit, they're gonna get pee-pee doo-doo bullshit. And if they like the pew-pew laser swords, we're gonna get the pew-pew laser swords. And if my son Jet wants to be in Revenge of the Sith and get shot by CGI stormtroopers, we're gonna do that too. And I'm gonna be in Revenge of the Sith. I'm gonna make a director cameo for the first time in my life, dressed as a blue alien guy. These Disney movies put it all in perspective, because you see what it looks like. When Rian Johnson made a movie, it's like nobody made a movie at all. This is a man without character, completely without character. This is a company completely without character, pursuing only mindless profit. George Lucas, of course, was pursuing profit too, but he's one man. He was calling the shots, and I think he used the opportunity to say something pretty fucking interesting and a little bit heartbreaking. He used it to create a four-armed alien diner guy with a big mustache named Dexter Jetster. You are never going to see something that stupid and that interesting from the Walt Disney Company, ever. Tip your hat to Mr. George Lucas, who has been fighting the fucking media war for years and years deserves a little recognition. And he's got a human heart. You can see it beating. Bump, 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 bump. A real human heart. J.J. Abrams should look into that because it's the ultimate mystery box. And I know he'll never have one. I know he has a handicap that prevents him from ever having a heart. But he should look into it, and he should try to recreate it stylishly as he does so many other tropes of Mr. Lucas's filmmaking. Thank you. This is Dagger Magazine signing off. Good night.